All right, and welcome everybody. So I guess we're ready to get started. So open floor. Ask your questions away or type in the conversation box and we'll get answers for you.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, this is Bill Cron from the R&D group. How you doing?
Doing well?
Doing great. Hey, I've got a question about the container support that's upcoming, and just looking for some guidance on when somebody would want to use, say, containers versus services, standard services and Service Fabric. I mean, I understand the purpose of both and have used both, but I'm trying to understand in Service Fabric specifically, what are the benefits of using containers over services?
Okay, so
help me understand that?
yeah, this is Mark here, Mark Fussell. So, hi, Bill.
Hi, Mark.
So we Service Fabric is a container orchestrator. It's an orchestrator we built for years that do orchestration of all sorts of different processes across machines. And what we use a lot in terms of our services is we orchestrate a set of processes and deploy those. Because it's an orchestrator though, and now there are container support inside Windows, as well as inside Linux and the Docker side of things, we can take all your processes and containerize those and orchestrate the containers. So the way we look at containers is that, the way we look at building an application is that you can build an application and you can consist of deploying a set of containers and a set of services as processes, and you can choose what's most appropriate for your application. So, for example, one thing that we've been seeing is that people are wanting to move IIS, ASP.NET 4 workloads, and they want to sort of use the term sort of modernizing those and using containerized deployment for those. And so one thing is that you can take Microsoft's IIS image, deploy your container image on top of that, and then use a Service Fabric just to deploy a set of containerized services. And in that way, you sort of have IIS deployment across a set of machines in using a Service Fabric as an orchestrator. Containerization also kind of gives you this resource constraint boundaries where you can set the CPU usage and network usage, and basically set the resource constraints you want to use. So that's typically where you also think about how you want to use containers. So I would say that if you sort of control all the code and you're happy and you build all the application yourself and you know all the code, we tend to think of deploying those as a set of processes as you do today. If you know that you want to put resource constraints around that, use containers to put the resource constraints. And then, of course, if you're wanting just to migrate some code, you just want to not really have to re-engineer it in any way. You just want to containerize it and deploy it across a set of machines, and a migration either from IIS or from other code you have. That's another fine direction to go.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we had a whole bunch of questions now. We've got one about how does Application Gateway fit with Service Fabric? What are the use cases where you would use Application Gateway instead of Load Balancer? And 3, what are the best case for creating a public-facing REST API Application Gateway and or Load Balancer?
So I can take this one. I'm Matt Snyder. We're answering Oliver's question there. Application Gateway and also Azure API Management fit in because they help kind of isolate or put a boundary in between your public-facing HTTP endpoints or service endpoints and the actual world. Both of those services have a whole bunch of features like DOS protection, certificates or security management, a bunch of good analysis and data that comes out of those APIs. And that saves you from having to build all of that as features of your own HTTP gateway. So we see a lot of people using those things because they get that level of isolation. They don't have to expose their services directly to the internet and deal with that. So the answer is most of the time, if your service is doing anything real, we would see people use either Azure App Gateway. More commonly, frankly, we see people using Azure API Management. That's usually just because of the types of services that people are running on top of Service Fabric. They have some overlapping features, so which one you use is really kind of up to you. But I think at this point we do see Azure API Management as the more common solution. what people typically do with Azure API management is they can either plug in code. It's a little goofy to try and plug in code, but you can do it. Or they use the HTTP forwarding to hit their services directly inside Service Fabric. That's, I'd say, usually the most common way forward that we see people going. So I hope that answers your question. Let us know in the comments if you have any follow-ups.
Okay, next is what's the status of Windows Server 2016 support for clusters?
Well, we just published Windows Server 2016 to Azure 2 days ago, I think it was.
Image gallery.
It's
Yeah.
in the gallery, so it's there now. And you can create VMs inside Azure using that, using Windows Server 2016.
You'll have to use an ARM template at this point. For the portal, we'll have a drop-down pretty soon.
Yeah, so we should probably publish you should use an ARM template to be able to do this. So then you can, in the ARM template, you specify Windows Server 2016 and you can create clusters from it.
So the next one is, can we use other Windows SKU other than 2012 R2 Data Center? Yes, 2016.
It's now there. Two birds, one stone.
So, no, I think the question may be that are we supporting only the data center SKU? So the answer to that question is in Azure, that actually is the image which is available to you. If you were wanting to use some other SKU for some reason, you have to bring your own image. And hopefully that answers the question.
So Jarl, quite a few serious bugs in SF lately. What are the steps you guys are taking to help avoid that going forward? So first of all, I'd love to know which specific ones you're talking about, because we might have a discussion about what the word serious means. But there's a couple of things that we're doing. The primary thing that we're doing is in your clusters now, there's the option to decide what version of the platform you're running on, and that will let you guys, the customers, have a little bit more control over what version of Service Fabric you're picking up, so if something does get introduced, you can catch it in your own tests. Because as much as we try, we're never going to have perfect tests, and things might affect only your application or only somebody else's application. So having that flexibility to choose, I think, helps a lot. The other thing is that, of course, as we run into these things, we are trying to figure out where the gaps are and add more testing and things like that on our side, so that they don't escape. But again, nothing's ever going to be perfect. So having that control and putting you guys in charge, I think is going to help out a lot to give you guys a chance to do some sort of basic integration or testing of your own with your applications to make sure that anything that does slip out doesn't impact your production workloads. And if you have any specific issues you were concerned about, let us know in the comments and we can address what we're doing maybe specifically.
Okay, the next one is we model our solution with actors' concept of ubiquitous language of any particular bounded context are represented as actor types, for example, asset, media file, library, account, user, etc. What would be the recommendations on managing an arbitrary large number of actor instances?
I think we're just parsing. 1 second.
Yeah, 1 second. I gotta take another look at that.
Well, I mean, some patterns that we've seen before, right? So there's the query stuff, which is built in now, but that's pretty rudimentary.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, we've seen people build kind of management services for their actors, which is a different stateful service. So say you had a dictionary that corresponded to some sort of manager, which when you created or modified or wanted to keep metadata on any of those actors, that request would flow through that manager. And that manager would keep that metadata in a separate collection. And that way, if you wanted to go find, let's say, media file, you wanted to go find all your media files that were MPEGs, right? That would be a piece of media data, metadata that you would keep in this manager service. And that would let you, run these types of queries and keep that sort of data handy in case you needed to do something with it. So that sort of manager pattern in a different stateful service is how we've seen people kind of dealing with the fact that the actor space can get really large. The benefit of that is that then you have that other central point where you can keep track of that type of stuff and do that other sort of operations.
Yeah, so we've seen people do that sort of thing, but I would suggest that if you have these sort of management requirements for querying data, then actors may not be the right choice for it. You might want to reconsider look into using reliable collections for that instead.
Right.
Generally, when you have this idea of I just want to throw objects up into space and then have something magically handle them, that's really not a good use case for actors, because as you see now you have to introduce these additional management layers that Matt was talking about. So a reliable collection might actually be better for you there. It's not, actors aren't a replacement for a database, we'll put it that way.
Yeah, especially if you want that sort of view across all the actors. If all the actors are really independent, sure, maybe they still make sense as actors, but if they have any sort of queries or metadata or things like that that you need to keep track across of them, either building that management layer or making it as a service in the first place might end up working better.
You want to read it, or you want me to read it? So are there any plans to support VM scale set auto scaling with the Service Fabric cluster? If so, will it dynamically make changes to the load balancer configuration associated with the cluster?
So there are two parts to this question. The very first one says that can you do auto scaling today? Answer to the question is scale up certainly works without any issues. Scale down has to be done slowly, and I have a doc which talks about that specifically. The second part of the question is, will that auto scale be driven by us? So today the auto scale is not driven by us. It actually is based just on the perf counters and the auto scaling of VMSs. There is actually a plan and a design which we're working on, which will actually be influenced by the load which you report, and then our failover manager will be driving that particular piece of the perf counter, and that's coming soon. I would say by soon will be sometime mid next year or so. Yeah, that's it.
Next question is, are any members of the team attending Dev Intersection Conference next week?
No.
I don't think so.
I don't think we have anybody going to that one.
Next question is, how do I set up SSL TLS over HTTPS for cluster service communication?
So you said cluster service to service communication. So I assume you mean you want SSL within the cluster. So the first thing I'm wondering is why. That's right. Yeah. Okay. So I'd be curious to know why you would need SSL within the cluster if you're within a VNet. That would be my first question. The only time I've seen
customers pushing for all data to be secured in transit.
Yeah, this is every service of mine has a certificate associated with it all, and
Yeah.
only these set of services talk about.
Right. So you can do that the same way you'd set up SSL for a front-facing service. It just comes down to the web server being opened up with an SSL endpoint. The problem is that you have to figure out a way to actually tie something, a domain or something to the search. So I've seen people do things like they'll make use of SANs and they'll use a service name in the SAN, because internally you're not going to get a separate domain for each machine. You're just going to have IPs.
That's
so you need
server alternate
something,
name, right?
yeah, server alternate names. So you need something more, something a little more static than just a VM IP inside. So I've seen people use service names for that, but it can get a little bit tricky.
The other thing as well is you have to make sure that you have all certificates have to be deployed to all machines, so that you have to do all your cert management through ARM for the deployment, and all your certs kept inside the key vault.
All right, next question is, all of the ARM template samples I've seen do not disable Windows updates. This seems hugely misleading, and having it enabled is risky. Any thoughts?
Yes, so Windows Update is actually on as a default in the image itself. So this was something which I can provide some guidance on in the documentation as to how to turn it off.
Okay. I'm looking for a way to ship Service Fabric generated ETW traces to our on-prem ELK stack. Do you have any guidance on how to achieve this? Yeah, there's an article on how to use ETW sending to ELK. That should still work because the ELK listener that's installed doesn't depend on anything. Carol, I saw you were on. Your article will work for on-prem too, right?
That is correct.
So there's an article under monitoring and diagnostics in the documentation. The next question is, SSL TLS appears to appears to require going outside the cluster and hitting the load balancer to work?
Yeah, this is related to the first question there. Y'all pretty much answered it. You have to use the machine name or like IP addresses and have a certificate for each, which makes it very difficult. So to kind of just use the default certificate, you have to go outside, hit the load balancer, and come back into the cluster for service-to-service communication.
The next question is, it possible to span a service fabric cluster across two regions for GOHA for instances. If data center is identified as a different fault domain, would a quorum be achievable if minimum replica size was set to 3 and target replica size was set to 7, and one data center fault domain became unavailable?
So
I think we've had this question in every single community Q&A.
Yeah.
Right? So
yeah.
thank you for
it's good.
keeping us honest.
We checked that box. That's good. So it is possible to span the cluster across multiple data centers or regions. There are some caveats. First of all, you need at least 3 for that. Second of all is that you need to today use Azure VNet gateways in order to connect all those clusters together, and those VNet gateways do have several downsides. I mean, besides being a whole other component in your ARM model that you need to manage and configure and all that, they have some pretty significant bandwidth limitations, which will probably constrain the types of solutions that you can build that can actually span across these data centers. Whether or not that actually impacts you will depend upon your app. But you do have it correct in that what'll end up happening is those 3 different data centers will appear as different fault domains. There's some additional configuration you need in your ARM template in order to give Azure that information, because by default, Azure doesn't know anything about things that span regions. So you kind of can put this prefix into your ARM template and say, hey, this is going to be the VMs in this VM scale set are actually in data center 1, the VMs in these VM scale sets are actually in data center 2. That becomes hierarchical fault domains that then Service Fabric uses to spread your replicas across those locations. There's a whole bunch of additional placement policies that you can use once the cluster is up and running like that. That said, I don't think we have anybody in production running this way yet. I know there's a whole bunch of different teams, both inside and outside Microsoft, doing experimentations on Azure configured this way. If you do stand a cluster up like this, there's a whole bunch of additional concerns that you have to deal with, like how does monitoring work, because a whole bunch of your Azure resources are going to be region specific, and figuring out how to configure that all up in a way that will make sense is still kind of left as an exercise to you. So it's a scenario that we're really pushing at. We've got a whole bunch of people trying and kicking different tires, and as that becomes more well documented and described, I think this is going to be a pretty big scenario. So if you're interested in trying it out, you can feel free to contact us, and we'll loop you in with all the things that we're currently trying to make this a real supported scenario.
All right, next question is, what's the best approach to implement a service that might use a lot of hard disk space? How to scale that and not overload the node's disks?
Looks like Bill S. down below has kind of a follow-up to this in a similar vein. We could probably take him at the same time, which is he says he needs to use actors for blobs on photos and related metadata and scale up to more than 15 terabytes. And blob storage is great, but may fit better to have actors as a cluster for us, the service to access. Well, I mean, in this case, I would actually say blob probably is a better choice for that. If you have blobs of binary data, blob storage is particularly well suited for that. You generally wouldn't want to pay compute costs to be storing things like images and video files. But worse than that, though, is you also have to pay for the replication costs. And when I say pay, I don't mean money, but pay in terms of performance to replicate these things, as well as rebuilding new replicas and things like that, right? So when you have failover situations, you have to take the time to actually copy all this data over to other nodes, which can actually slow your solution down quite a bit. So generally, for stateful services like actors and reliable services, the state that you actually keep on disk and in memory on the nodes should be more like hot state that's in your hot path, critical path. So URLs, for example, that refer to blobs or to binary data out in blob storage. So it's actually probably better to store that stuff in blob storage than it is on the nodes themselves.
Yeah, we did that exact solution for an internal product team inside of Microsoft, and they're storing, I believe, about 2 petabytes of data now.
That's a lot of data.
So that it actually works quite well.
But I mean, to answer
Out
the
on
original
blob
question-
storage.
Out on blob storage, yeah.
Yeah.
But to answer the original question, how much data can I store? I mean, it comes down to the choice of disk size you have on the machine. And at some point, you have to build your solution and then look at the storage costs that you have or you've chosen for each one of your services, and then do the capacity plan for that.
And also, don't forget that you have to plan for failovers. So try not to have a replica state to be so large that it's very difficult to fail over.
Yeah, and that's true in general. There's essentially some capacity overhead that you should always plan for. So remember, you're always going to have multiple copies of the data because it gets replicated. And then you want some overhead capacity available too, so that when machines do fail, when the machines fail, your overall capacity is reduced, and so you need some place to be able to move data around. And it's always good to plan for having at least one upgrade domain and one fault domain's worth of capacity overhead, because there's always a situation where during an upgrade you're going to have one upgrade domain down, which is 1/5 of your capacity. And then there's always a possibility that during an upgrade you're going to lose another fifth of capacity due to a fault domain failing. These are rare circumstances, but they can happen. And so it's essentially 2/5 of capacity overhead that you at least want to plan for, so that you have somewhere to be able to move state during these situations. And so when you're looking at storage on VMs, that can get quite costly. So if you have large amounts of data, terabytes and petabytes of data, blob storage is very well suited for that.
But I think the salient point is the state that you should keep inside of actors or reliable services or anything is the hot state. It's the state that you're mutating, that you're doing work on, that you're running compute against all the time. I wouldn't store cold JPEGs or movie files or things that you're not currently manipulating inside the cluster. Generally, that's just not cost effective.
Yeah, you can. I mean, it's better. It scales out a little better too if you store it out on separate storage, because if you're storing it in the cluster, then you have to serve that traffic from within the cluster too, and that's going to eat up bandwidth inside the cluster. Whereas if you have it out in blob storage, you can make use of the bandwidth provided by blob storage and save yourself the trouble from within the cluster. So it's actually better in a couple ways.
Okay, next question is, what's the recommended approach to get Azure Diagnostic Traces to application insights? There isn't a recommended approach today to do that. We're getting closer to having a solution. The recommended approach still is to use event source, send it to Azure Diagnostics, the table storage, or to use the ELK solution that we have out there. We are getting much closer to having a better story, but we're not quite there. Carol, do you want to say anything?
No, that's about it.
Okay. I didn't know if you want to talk about the new thing you published.
Well, I mean, we have a NuGet package in preview. It's an in-process library that sends data sourced from event source or from traces to application insights, Event Hub, Elasticsearch. If you guys are interested, we can send you links to the NuGet packages, as well as there's open source on GitHub for that.
Yeah, just give the name of it so they can.
Yeah, it's called Event Flow. So if you look onto NuGet, search for Microsoft Diagnostics, Microsoft.diagnostics.eventflow, because there's another event flow package there that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about.
Okay, thank you. Application gateway follow-up question: are there others using for API management gateway in Service Fabric on-premise scenarios?
Yeah, not super common, but we do see people using Azure API management as a kind of cloud front end for on-premise services. So what you'd see in those cases are, whether or not it's a Service Fabric cluster or not, you have some service that's running on-prem, you want to expose it to the world, but you don't want to do it all yourself. So you set up Azure API management to serve again as that secure, monitored, analytical gateway. And then you connect that Azure API management front down into your on-premises environment, usually through something like ExpressRoute. that we've seen a few customers do something like that when they have on-premise solutions that they want to turn into services exposed in the cloud. So yeah, that is a pattern that we've seen.
All right, next is how can we report load from an actor service? For example, number and type of actors instances.
So the only way to do that today is in the programming model, we expose a thing called actor service, which is kind of a layer below the actual actor objects. You would write at that layer something that kept track of the number of actors, watch the activations, watch maybe the messages coming in, whatever you're trying to keep track of. And that has access to the full kind of service layer. That's where you would get the service partition object, which would have the report load API on it. So you wouldn't report from within the actor itself. You'd have to have some way of getting that information at the service layer and passing it down.
There's also an event stream of ETW events coming off the actor service that you could subscribe to, and you could put that together on the back end.
Mm-hmm.
The actor service, by the way, is literally a stateful service, so you can actually override run async there the same way that you would in a regular stateful service.
Yep, do all sorts of
that is definitely the right way to go.
What are the requirements for deployment standalone cluster?
I think we skipped one. Well, that's okay. We'll do this one.
Sorry.
We'll go back.
No, I'll go back. How do you ensure consistency across actor states when performing a backup?
Yeah, Phil, the only way you can do that really is you have a coalescence period where the writes have to stop. You have to know that the work has coalesced, and then you do the backup so that you get a consistent snapshot across all of the different partitions. But in general, if you designed it such that you have these types of consistency borders that spread across multiple partitions, whether it's actors or whether it's across reliable services, you're going to have a hard time. And so I'd advise also thinking about if there's ways to consolidate those consistent pieces of data so that they're in one place. But also if you do have these requirements where the consistent piece of information, say it's some reference ID or something like that, is spread across multiple places and needs to be consistent across multiple services, you have to have some kind of reconciliation mechanism that can push them into a consistent space. That way, even if you take a snapshot in the middle without doing this time for everything to coalesce, when the service wakes up, it can do some sort of basic bookkeeping and say, well, if I have this basic ID, then this ID must be present in all these other places, and if it's not, then here's the information I need to send them. It's really complicated to build, but depending upon the requirements of your actual service, it may be better to build that than to try and take the downtime where you can't change anything. Because stopping the world in order to take that consistent backup is actually quite hard.
Next one. What are the real requirements for deploying a standalone cluster on physical servers? Are the machine for the node should be pre-configured, ports should be opened?
Sorry.
Yep.
What do we request?
Andrew's question right there.
Can you read it?
Yes, I can see. Okay. So the requirements. So I would just say follow my instructions on the documentation. So specifically, it doesn't matter whether it's a physical machine or they are VMs. In both cases, you actually have to go to each node, make sure that the nodes required, which are defined in your clusters.json, those ports are open. They're also secure. You clearly understand the IP addresses, and so forth. Yes, all those things should be pre-configured before we show up, because the only things which we do at that point is try and do some Windows firewall changes, and that's all we do.
Yeah, I mean, there's 5 or 6. There's 5 ports in the cluster manifest that you define for the JSON file. There are 5 ports effectively that you have to have open in order to be able to build network traffic or connect to any particular endpoint to do management on it.
So follow my doc.
That's all you need to do is open up those ports, have network connectivity, and then after that, and then you, for the deployment mechanism, you need to be able to just make sure, as Chaka says in his doc, you have to have admin privileges for if you want to deploy it across all the machines to be able to copy the packages onto them and install them.
All right, next one. Is there an upgrade path to Windows Server 2016 images, or do we have to recreate the cluster?
So whenever you do an OS upgrade, you have to do it slowly, very slowly. It's almost like upgrading Yeah, so the way you do it is one node at a time. So you go take one machine down or one VM down, upgrade it to the latest version of 2016, because these things take time. So you cannot afford to lose more than one machine or a couple of machines in your particular upgrade domain. So do it slowly, and you really do not have to recreate the cluster.
Next question is the number of node types in a cluster unlimited? If it isn't, is there a plan to increase the number of node types? The reasoning for this is a multi-tenant scenario where we have a single massive resource-hungry tenant. We would like to give this tenant its own set of applications. We would like also to segregate it onto a separate node type from our other tenants using placement constraints. Is this a valid case, or is there another way to do this? You would model the solution. There's a different way to model it.
There's no limit to the number of node types. So feel free to create a separate node type and then constrain them to that node type if that's really what they want. Yeah, you have it right. I guess the question is, I mean, there are other ways to do it, but that one is probably the simplest. The one thing you have to be careful of is that you've effectively created a subcluster in that sense. So that customer that is constrained to that set of nodes, you have all the same problems a little bit that we were talking about earlier, where you need to make sure that there's enough capacity. You need to make sure that if nodes go down and don't compact, that there's enough spare nodes in that environment, that there's some way to fail them over and deal with that. Typically, we say that unless the customer really requires their own dedicated machines, you're better off just creating different application instances, and that will let them run in different processes. You can put different security boundaries on the different processes. You can use Service Fabric's cluster resource management to dictate that whatever consumption is coming out of those different services, whether or not they're for the big beefy customer or the smaller customers, that they're getting enough of those resources on the cluster, and Service Fabric will take care of reorganizing the cluster. That route is more complicated in the sense that you have to interact with all these other components of Service Fabric, but it is more flexible in the sense that you don't have to worry so much about effectively creating this little subcluster within the bigger cluster. So we've seen people go both ways.
This reminds me of a talk at Ignite done by some guy, some jerk, about using load metrics to do something very similar.
That was me. Was that me?
Nah, I think it was me, actually.
Oh.
I'll post a link, but there's a way you can accomplish this using load metrics and capacities on nodes. So in the demo, what we did is we put capacities on the nodes that represented a set of work units, and that's just some arbitrary thing we made up. So we said each node has 100 work units. And in the demo, we created a bunch of little services with 10, 20, 50 work units. And then we said we have this one customer that comes along, and he needs a dedicated node. So we gave his application a load metric of 100 work units, which is equal to the capacity of each node. And what Service Fabric will do is it'll move the smaller workloads out of the way so that it can find a place for the large workload to run. And because it's reporting a load metric that's equal to the capacity of the node, it ends up getting a node all to itself. And so that's one other approach you can take. And that's, again, a little bit nicer than using placement constraints and node types, as Matt was saying. Then you don't have these segregated little clusters that you have to manage, and you kind of just let the platform do the work. So I'll post a link in the chat window to that talk. If you fast forward to the very end, you'll see that demo.
Long answer.
All right, next one. Is there a way to call an actor method and not wait until complete, but be sure that the actor receives the command? What about calling multiple agents methods without awaiting them?
Yeah, you can. I mean, so when you call an actor method, it's just an asynchronous call. It's a task returning asynchronous call. So you can do whatever you want with that task. You don't necessarily have to await it. You can attach a continuation onto the task, for example, and process it asynchronously from the actor method itself, right? So you can attach a continuation and then examine the task that you get back. You can either look at the result, you can look at the task status to see if it was faulted or completed. All that sort of stuff happens out of band with the regular actor method. Now the thing that's important though is if after that actor method comes back, if you need to write state back into the actor that called it, you won't be able to do that in a continuation, because the continuation is going to execute outside the bounds of a transaction for the actor state manager. So you won't actually be able to save state back in there. You have to be running inside one of the single-threaded turn-based methods to actually write state.
Right,
but yeah,
from the
you can
client
do
side.
that though. It's the client side or whoever's making the call to the actor. If the call is being done by an actor itself, then you'll be outside of that. But yeah, it's just a task, so you can work with it the same way you would work the tasks in .NET normally.
Okay.
Same thing with if you have multiple agents, methods without awaiting them. Same thing. You can initiate 5 calls to an actor and then look at those 5 tasks and manage them any way you want. Right? You can do a wait all on those, or you can attach continuations to each one. Again, they're just tasks.
Next question. Is it recommended to use premium disks rather than the standard temp disk configuration for VM scale set for Service Fabric cluster?
So in general, there is really no reason to use premium disks at all. You should use temp disks for storing your data, unless you have a specific need for a managed disk. Managed disks feature is now in preview, so you can certainly use managed disks, attach them to your nodes, and use them for anything. For example, if there is a specific need for certain I/O operations, certainly you can try to use that. Otherwise, premium disks are really not needed for Service Fabric itself.
And often the reason why is also because you get less local disk capacity with those particular VM disks.
So Mark is talking about the use of DS SKU versus D SKU. DS comes with premium storage. That particular version of the SKUs come with very little disk. The amount of disk is very, very small. They are typically not very useful, and you do run out of them, and it creates more issues. So if you truly need premium disks, use managed disks, and on a normal D series, V2 series VMs.
Any plans to publicly publish some information when bugs are reported so that others can keep up to date with the status and know what to be on the lookout for?
So I think probably the best answer for this is our Service Fabric issues page on GitHub. We've been getting quite a bit of traction there, people reporting issues and having conversations. We aren't currently posting bugs that are discovered internally to that location, although that's probably something that we should look at to take at least critical bugs that we discover and put them out there. But that's really the best place to look for a summary of the list of issues.
I have an OMS with Service Fabric solution plugin, and it's working well, but it's built in one region location with GeoHA Service Fabric cluster. What can you advise to have one OMS workspace watching them all? This is what Matt was indicating. We haven't really worked out how to do this yet, so at this point we really can't give you any advice on how to do that with OMS or any other particular monitoring solution.
Yeah, this is an example of the type of conversations that we're having within Azure to try and figure out, once you get these types of geographically distributed Service Fabric clusters, how do all the other parts fit together? And we don't have a good answer yet for a lot of them.
How to best update config in a running cluster?
Assuming you mean...
I answered that question.
Okay.
Okay.
Is it config of the cluster or config of your applications?
So...
What did you answer?
I'm not asking you, Chuck.
Okay, so I answered.
What was the question?
So the question was basically I assumed that the question was about how do you update the cluster configs. So I did provide 2 links in the thread, which talk about that. And then it all depends on whether you have your cluster in automatic mode versus in manual mode.
And if you are asking about service config and application config, of course there's a built-in mechanism for that called config packages, and there are APIs in C# you can use to attach event handlers to when config gets updated. And that's all documented up on Azure.com. I'll provide some links.
All right. Next is any ETA on when Windows Server 2016 Nano Server will be supported as an option for the cluster. Also, when will Service Fabric be supporting Nano Server containers, Windows Server core containers?
So with respect to Windows Server core containers, so it should be in the next couple of releases. It should be coming very soon as a preview. Nano Server, it's something that we are working on. It's probably at this point, it's going to be a few months away. So it's, sometime next year is when we are going to see the support for Nano Server. But Windows Server containers, it should happen very soon, within the next couple of releases from
Well,
Fabric.
the next release we have, now that Windows Server 2016 is GA, a preview for containers.
Hey, Phil, could you mute?
I got it.
There, thanks.
Bill, if you actually want to talk, come back in. Sorry.
Next question is, we've been hit by the timeout exception, bad resolving between nodes.
It's Phil again. I'll just keep on. Keep going.
Do you know the end?
Keep
Does
going.
anybody know this issue?
Is this what network pack? Is this when you say bad except? Is this uploading packages, or is this because you've got
It could be
a
replication.
cluster?
Yeah.
Cluster.
Yeah, Jarl, sorry, we're going to need more info on that one. It's a little vague.
Yeah.
Nick, we'll try again.
Moving on to the next one. One-to-many pattern and query-like patterns. For example, a vendor has many active work orders. If I store a work order as actors, I have not a good way to query a set of vendor orders. Can nested work orders in the same object as vendors, but not very clean either way. And work orders are then not separate actors. Everyone will have to manage work orders via specific vendor actor.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the design choice you have to make, right? So if you split all those work orders into different actors, that's fine, but you need some sort of list or metadata kept probably within that vendor or within some other entity that makes sense to you, so that you can go and retrieve that set of work orders. That's kind of that manager pattern that we were talking about a little bit before. So you might consider, in this case, what is the work order as an actor concept buying you, right? If you need that sort of query across them. So it's just a design point, right? And if you do decide to split them across in actors, which is not, wrong necessarily, if you do have these requirements, you do have to build it somewhere. Even if you built it as a stateful service, you'd have to find some way to query across them, right? So you'd need some way to say, well, here's all the orders associated with this particular vendor, or here's all the orders with a total value of greater than 10. If you have that type of metadata or want to do those types of queries, you almost always end up building a different separate service that provides that view or that index into that other remote service. There's really not another way out of it. This is what you're running into fundamentally is that you're in a NoSQL sharded, distributed data environment, which means you've given up that global view of everything. And if you want those types of queries, you have to build some service in order to keep track of the data that you want to query against and to serve those queries. There's really no other way out of it. The only other thing we've seen people do is have, if you're only asking like totally ad hoc questions and you only care about last month's totals, then you can take your services and have them periodically save their data into some remote data store like SQL, Data Lake, DocDB, what have you. And then you can run your ad hoc lazy queries in that environment and get back that global view again. But that really only works if you're comfortable with that data being, cold and not current, right? If you really need consistent, perfectly up-to-date queries with respect to data that is live in the cluster that is being mutated, the only way to do it is to build some other services.
Okay, to clarify, how Service Fabric handles large number of actor instances up and running?
We handle it fine. I mean, every single actor is really just a row in a dictionary. That's really what it boils down to. So you can think of it as a row in a dictionary with a little lock around it. So there's not tons of complexity related to the actor model itself. They all have their own little threads and timers, and that's about it. So no major concerns with having a large number of actors, just like we don't really mind if you have a lot of rows in your dictionaries.
Can you give a comparison between IaaS VM availability sets, vault domains, upgrade domain SLA, and the scale set for Service Fabric cluster? Is this also providing similar guarantees?
Yes. Okay, Steve, good question. So there's actually a doc which I wrote, which if you search Service Fabric node types and VMSS, so you would find that doc. Specifically, what that means is we ourselves do not provision VMs. They are provisioned in an availability set for every single VMSS which we use, so that we use the same FDUDs which an availability set gives you. So there is no specific difference between the node types which we have versus the VMSS scale set definition in terms of FDs and UDs. So they give you the same SLAs, they actually are the same. So there is no difference. And I can point you to that doc in the IM window.
Thank you.
I'm going to skip the couple. We're still back if you guys are following along with the questions. I'm going to skip the couple that are more comments.
But yeah, sure, go ahead and add them in.
Yep. See an issue, throw it up on GitHub.
Is there a way to call a specific instance of a stateless service, similar to how we can call a specific partition of a stateful service?
Yes, so you can always address a specific instance. Most of the time, though, I would say that's a weird thing to do because they're stateless, and so addressing a single instance of a stateless service doesn't make a whole lot of sense. They're all the same. But yeah, you can do it a couple of ways. So if you're using service partition resolution, if you're resolving service addresses based on the service name, what you'll actually get back is a list of addresses for every instance, and so you can then pick one that you want. The other way that you can do it too is if you know the set of nodes that the stateless service is running on, you can just connect directly to the node by its IP. You don't even actually have to do service resolution. Now the only real scenario where I've seen that you actually want to connect to a specific stateless service is if you have a watchdog, and the watchdog is kind of looking at each stateless service and pinging it and testing it to see if it's up or something like that. There aren't very many other scenarios I've seen where you actually want to connect to a specific instance of a stateless service. If you find yourself in that situation, then really what you have is a stateful service.
Yeah, you might actually have a stateful service.
Yeah.
Well, but they also might want to partition their stateless service.
You could partition your stateless service, but then you might have multiple service instances inside of that partition.
That's true.
You're right back kind of where you started.
Right.
I think the other thing to be aware of is that every single time that stateless service restarts, you're going to get a different service instance ID, and so that's going to be cycling all the time. So you're going to have a hard time differentiating between whether or not a service went down and came back up, or whether or not it's moved, or all of those cases are going to be a little bit hard to figure out.
So what you're saying is you don't know that you're actually pinging the same instance over time.
Right.
Because they're changing and moving, and they're stateless, yeah. You're really looking at a stateful service.
Stateless services are really meant to be all completely interchangeable. Again, think about why you might be trying to talk to a particular one, and see if that is actually a piece of state or something that you're hanging on.
I suspect it's because there's state in there.
It's usually state, or you might say it's a sticky session, at which point the session information is the state. There's a whole bunch of things that traditionally were done inside of stateless, and I'm using air quotes, which you can't see over the phone call, but stateless, I'm saying this as air quotey as I can, stateless services which actually were stateful because they held on to session state or were backed by some other backing service or something like that. In those cases, you're probably better off modeling it as a stateful service because it'll give you what you're looking for.
And we can all attest he actually did the air quotes, so.
I was doing,
That's true.
I saw them as big as I could.
He's also wearing a funny hat, which you can't see either.
Is it possible to port a Service Fabric application written for Windows, C#, ASP.NET Core to Linux? What kind of tools would be needed? I make this question because I noticed recently that the price gap between Linux and Windows VMs is quite significant. And kind of Windows is 100.
Yeah,
whatever.
It is. Price difference.
Yeah,
There's a price difference. So the answer is yes, you can do that. In fact, one of the demos that we did show was, if you remember the Age of Ascent game, we had that running on .NET Core on Windows, and so we worked with Ben Adams from Illyriad Games to make it run on .NET Core on Linux. So yes, it is possible. Now, having said that, a couple of caveats. So there are a couple of features that are not present in Linux right now since it's in preview. One of them is reliable collections. So if your application on Windows is using reliable collections, well, you will have to rewrite that, or using actors, or get rid of stateful collections and use an external database in order to make it work on Linux. But yes, you can. In terms of tooling, we do. You can use the Linux you can pretty much develop your application on Windows and then use Azure CLI or equivalent to deploy it onto a Linux cluster. So in the next month or so, we'll actually write a blog post on our experiences getting Age of Ascent to run on .NET Core on Linux. But meanwhile, a couple of caveats, issues that you run into are if you have entry scripts that are using PowerShell or Windows-specific commands, you'll have to rewrite them on Bash or PowerShell on Linux. That might you install PowerShell on Linux, and that might be a way to go. The other thing that I would like to call out is with respect to tracing. Event tracing for Windows is not available on Linux, so you'll have to use a framework that is available on Linux like LTTNG or something to do your tracing. But in short, yes, you can do this, and it has been done.
What are the current plans for improving Service Fabric built-in reverse proxy, multiple SSL domain support, etc., granular control over endpoint addresses?
The main thing we're focusing on right now is the second point you have there, granular control over endpoint addresses. So what we're doing is we're working on a way to allow you to set policies per listener in your service and determine whether or not that's exposed out through the service through the reverse proxy. So essentially, today reverse proxy you can connect to any service through it, and we're going to allow you a way to set policies on that so that you can choose which services are accessible through the reverse proxy. So yeah, that's the primary thing we're working on today for reverse proxy.
And Marcin, some of the other things that you mentioned or probably have in mind are what Service Fabric would today traditionally defer to something like API management or app gateway, especially around if you were going to say, well, if I want this more complicated security setups, or I want monitoring, or I want analytics, all that type of integration is today best done via API management or app gateway.
And there are other features. I mean, the other feature we built into that is the ability to return secondary addresses from the reverse proxy. You'll see in the next release.
All right. Any next question is, any more thought done on having another media for doing discussions in? Yammer isn't the greatest. No code formatting, no editing of posts, etc.
No immediate plans. I mean, we threw out the idea in a previous Q&A about opening a Slack team. There was sort of mixed response to that. Some people loved the idea. Some people hated the idea. I think Gitter is another one that's been suggested. So we'd love to hear your feedback on what you'd like to see. We don't really want to open up like 4 or 5 different additional channels, because I think people are already a little bit concerned about things being spread too thin across the ones that we have. So if we can coalesce around one additional one that we want to add, that'd be great. We can take that forward.
Next couple questions on application insights. Yes, the NuGet package, Microsoft Service Fabric Telemetry Application Insights, has been abandoned. You should not be using that at all. We unpublished it, and we've tried to remove links, but it's very hard to do on the internet. So if you still have it, please try to come up with something else to use. You should look at the event flow package that Carol's team has been working on, and there's links a little bit lower in that. But that's in preview. Don't use that yet. The next question is it possible to use data encipherment certificate to manage secrets without securing the cluster?
That's an interesting question. So I'm going to say yes, you can do that, but then I'm going to ask, why on earth would you want to not secure the cluster if you're doing data encipherment? I mean, you can do this. You can have a data encipherment certificate and manage secrets, but if your cluster is unsecured, I can come on there and delete all your services. So it's a very odd thing to do.
You probably want to still secure the cluster.
I would suggest you definitely still want to secure the cluster. Yes, you can do the data encipherment certificate alone, but we definitely do not recommend that.
Okay, there's all the event flow links, and the next question is, with regards to GeoHA, I still don't understand why you need 3 data centers. If you can get enough replicas on both data centers, the loss of one DC FD shouldn't constitute quorum loss for the remaining FD DC. You aren't operating in a GeoGA scenario. Now the cluster is running only on one FD DC built in HA inside the remaining FD DC. Happy to take this conversation offline.
Yeah, we can take it offline. The main thing to keep in mind is that we have to keep the cluster itself up, and we don't have enough. There's got to be one side that's going to end up with the quorum of the main nodes that keep the cluster up. So no matter what happens, if you take down one half, either the other half keeps running or both halves fall down, and there's really no way to deal with it.
Any chance of ASP.NET Core support for 5.3 coming soon? Do you plan any IIS-like support for Kestrel, deeply integrated reverse proxy port sharing done in Service Fabric reverse proxy level?
Yeah, so we're releasing ASP.NET Core Communication Listener. That's a server-side piece. We're releasing a preview of that in 5.4, which is our next upcoming release. IIS support for Kestrel, no. So Kestrel is a very different beast. We actually support a different web server called Web Listener, which is based on HTTP/sys, and that gives you all the port sharing capability that you want. But for Kestrel, it works a little bit differently. But look out for that in 5.4.
So I answered Faisal's question offline in the thread, and I will be also publishing a new set of ARM templates coming soon. So.
Okay. IP addresses. Usually public IPs only allowed in DMZ. Private addresses in interior subnets, front, back end. For security is the best practice for security of a service fabric cluster documented somewhere.
Steve, great question. So we are in the process of documenting it and also giving you some samples. Expect that in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, currently it's on a blog that we're trying to get it into the official documentation on how to do this.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we will have best practices of specifically talking about some scenarios which customers have brought up.
There's a blog done by Brett Steinman at the moment where this information's on that we worked with him, but we're trying to get that into the docs.
Next question is deployment of the Service Fabric on Windows Server 2016 production ready. We're at a point where we've set up production cluster with the default ARM template running 2012, but have not deployed to production workloads yet, so it is upgrading 2016 now would be ideal where we can just recreate the cluster instead of having upgrade one node at a time.
Answer to that question is yes, unless you're now trying to use the containers as well.
Yeah.
So if you're not using any new features in the container world, there's no difference. You can go to production in 2016.
Well, the current release doesn't support Windows containers anyway.
Oh,
so,
okay,
so it can't do it. So, but the current release of Windows Service Fabric standalone Windows for Service Fabric works on 2016 and G8.
Yes, standalone and in Azure.
Next question is for Chaco.
Yes. Okay, so this was the config question. Looks like that got answered because Was answered the question as to how to.
Yeah.
Are there plans to support broadcast a message to multiple services of a given type?
Not today, not by any of the built-in transports, but you could use the service resolution mechanisms to get the addresses and then do a UDP broadcast or something like that. That would be left as an exercise. We're not planning on building anything there at this time.
Next question is, will the work from
That's David.
Yeah. Be added to Service Fabric and supported?
Yeah, so again, that's the ASP.NET Core Communication Listener that we're releasing in preview in 5.4. It's not exactly the same as what David developed, but we will be introducing ASP.NET Core support.
Oh, it looks like Carol. Oh,
yeah. Brett.
Oh, sorry. What is the status of Service Fabric automatically handling Windows updates?
I answered that question. It's coming. We're trying to work. This is one of the biggest things which is a feedback for us. We've been working on it. You can expect some kind of help coming in the next couple of months.
Standalone cluster setup on physical machine. Oh, that's you answering a question. Sorry. Bill's question. Did we already talk about how multiple stateless web services can listen on port 8443 in the cluster?
I don't believe we talked about that, but I'm not sure precisely what your question is. So if you do have multiple stateless web services that are trying to listen on the same set of ports, you can do that. That's possible today with ASP.NET Core Web Listener and also with Katana, which uses HTTP/sys under the covers for port sharing. So that's all possible, and you can also open up you can actually create multiple ASP.NET applications within a single service and listen on different ports for each application. So it's basically two web servers running in one service, running two different ASP.NET applications, and each one opens up on different ports. So yeah, that's all possible today.
Phil's question, in the previous release, you reverted ASP.NET Core to preview due to the lack of production-ready certification of Kestrel Web Server. We're using Kestrel. Should we be worried?
So the reason we did that is because Kestrel today is, the recommendation from the ASP.NET team is to not use Kestrel as an internet-facing web server because it is susceptible to certain denial of service attacks. So if you're using it as an internet-facing service out to the public internet, then you should be careful about that. Their recommendation is to put a reverse proxy in front of it, either IIS or Nginx or something like that. The other alternative, of course, is Web Listener. So Web Listener at the time was not available in a release. It was in a preview. It was 0.1, I think, at the time. So now the ASP.NET team has released a 1.0 RC2 of Web Listener. So if you can switch to Web Listener, we'd recommend that over Kestrel for the time being. Kestrel will be available as an edge-facing server sometime probably next year.
Brian's question is, can you speak to some of the latency we are seeing when communicating between nodes in a cluster? Sometimes we see calls take up to 3 or 4 seconds to respond via service remoting. Also, how is the time sync between VM sets?
So calls taking 3 or 4 seconds to respond is a little bit suspicious. We generally don't see that kind of latency. The times that I have seen calls take more than a few seconds, it's usually because there's something on the receiving end that's doing extra work, that's blocking it. For instance, like making a call out to some other storage provider or something like that. So it's hard to say, but generally we in our performance tests we don't see that kind of latency. So I would recommend doing some performance profiling and see if you can find any bottlenecks there.
And I don't think you can count on time being consistent across the nodes. In a scale set or even across scale sets.
Yeah, so no, there's no time syncing between the VMs.
You'll see lots of time.
Even if there was, don't count on it for anything.
Don't count on it. Yes. Please don't.
Never use that for anything.
Okay, some more answers here. Actor DI question: when implementing your own auto actor factory function inside actor runtime register actor async, is there a way to get a handle on the state manager of that actors so I can wrap it up with my own class and instantiate my actor with it?
So there's actually another function when you're creating an actor service, you can actually pass in a function that creates the state manager, and that will automatically get piped down into your actors for you. So check out the constructor for actor service. There's places you can plug that in.
Anders has a question. We're seeing services going into warning and staying there for a long time, 5 minutes. When starting up new instances of application type, if the number of replicas on the node is higher than a certain threshold, if the services in warning work fine and are running, I'm guessing that it's due to the service fabric having to relocate services and balance everything out, but it takes so long for the services to show as healthy. When we're below this threshold, they return to healthy pretty quickly as expected. Replicas per node threshold seems to be 120-ish in this case, I'm remembering correctly.
We'd really need to know what that warning was in order to know what it's talking about. I mean, it could be the activation timeout, where it's just taking longer for the service to respond to API calls or something like that. If you have this sort of limit that you know that generally nodes don't like to have more than X instances of your service on it, that's when you might want to start looking into setting up capacity and things like that.
Also, check the VM size you're running on.
Sure.
Yeah. Event tracing for Windows is not supported on Linux, as Manny said, but event source and event listener types do work on .NET Core.
We're running out of time, so I think what we're going to do is we're going to grab the... Are we running out of time?
Well, yeah, I think we're a little bit over.
Yeah.
But we can take maybe a couple more.
Take a few more. They haven't kicked us out of the room yet. So
yeah, no, we're talking fast because we're a little bit over here.
Will ARM templates be available on GitHub as they are today?
Sorry, what
new
was
ones, ARM templates. You're going to publish them to GitHub?
Yes. I answered that question.
Okay. I don't think this is a question that I skipped. Oh, that's
running resolver.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. When running resolve async in a loop while upgrading the application, partition URL does not change after the upgrade. It shows URL in the previous deployment. Is that a known bug?
So it comes down to usage. I'm assuming you're talking to service partition resolver. So when you do resolve async, you need to you're going to get an address back. You need to try the address and see if it works. And if it doesn't, what you need to do is you need to take the partition that you got from resolve async, pass it back into resolve async, and that's an indication to us that you need to re-resolve the address, because we cache all the addresses internally. So by passing a partition back in, it invalidates the cache. I actually have some sample code up on GitHub I can post here for you to take a look at.
Okay. Down to Nathan's question. Any guidance on adding Service Fabric hosted or nodes hosted in AWS to an Azure Service Fabric cluster?
I'm in the process of just writing that answer, so I will come there.
Steve's question. You guys are very collaborative and it's appreciated. Thanks.
Not a question, but we'll take it.
Thanks for the outreach, Ed. Okay, we have started including our websites as an application in our Service Fabric cluster. The websites has whoa, what the heck is be packaged and then imported into a Service Fabric, into a developer local Service Fabric cluster. It makes it very difficult to debug, i.e., when we are using IIS Express. What the heck is going on?
No. You're screwing.
Are you doing something on the screen?
So the answer is we know that this is a pain point. I know that there's some work going on in the VS tooling to support this type of scenario and make it easier. The personal hack that I use, which Voss taught me, is to just go to where the application is running once it's inside the cluster, edit the local files on disk, and reload the web page. And that way, if you're doing a bunch of JavaScript hacking or things like that, you can iterate pretty quick. That's kind of gross because then you have to remember to take your changes and put them actually back into your actual service code before you do any sort of redeployment, but it does let you go a little bit faster.
I came up with another janky way to do it too. Is you can use a compilation flag and switch between build modes in Visual Studio, right? Like between debug and release. I introduced a new one called like local, and when I do that build flag, what I do is instead of registering the website as a service with Service Fabric runtime, I just spin up the web server. So then I can say, set this thing as the startup project in VS, hit F5, and using that compilation flag, it'll just run it as a standalone web application. Then I can edit it in place. So it's another janky way to do it.
Yeah.
Again, I have
aside from all the hacks, we will have this in the tooling in the next release.
Thanks,
which is awesome. Thank you, Mikkel.
Clarifying the question on Actor DI, I don't want to implement my own state manager. Just want to wrap the provided one. Is the answer still applicable?
Yeah. I'm just saying that there's just a place where you can inject a state manager. So it's an interface, right? It's iActor State Manager, and when you create the Actor service, there's a function you can provide which just says, here's the Actor State Manager I want you to use. And so you can pass in a wrapper there. You can pass one that wraps the actual Actor State Manager. You can just toss that in there.
Is there a best practice architecture examples published around secure Service Fabric cluster deployment, not from a certificate standpoint?
We're working on this, yes. Oh, is this because you want to use AAD? I mean, so effectively, we're
publishing or something else. Are there other examples coming?
So, yes. So Daryl, is your question that can I use anything outside certificates to secure a cluster? Is that the question? Anyway, so there will be some best practices coming. Hopefully that answers your question. We will talk about AAD as well and how you can use that for admin and client operations.
I think
that's it.
There's a problem that's about NSGs specifically.
From an NSG standpoint.
Yep. Yeah. There will be best practices for NSG as well.
Yep.
Yes, the NSG is important where you can lock down just the ports that you want to expose just for the applications that are running inside your cluster.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.
I think that's it.
To the end of the questions. Thank you all.
We have this booked up each month, so there's going to be one in November. Actually, we'll publish that this week. So there's one in November and one in December. So I don't know what the next date is if anyone knows it just yet.
Yeah. But in about a month, there'll be another opportunity. Invite your friends.